All right, welcome back in. I hope you're doing really well. We're talking about the Detroit Lions today and just the offensive side of the football. And this is the 2020 offseason. We really want to focus on just the highlights of the offense and what we think Detroit's going to look like in 2020. Now, past the draft, we're past the free agent major signing period, and unless the Lions make a big trade, they've done all their major acquisitions. Of course, you're going to find that fifth-round draft pick or that undrafted rookie who actually makes the roster and even has some significant playing time. That doesn't usually change the direction of the team too much during the course of a given season. That's unusual. So we kind of know, we kind of got a good idea here of what the Lions offense is going to look like, and we're going to talk about that today. Thank you for watching. I really get a kick out of making these videos. You have no idea how big a kick I get out of analyzing the teams, and then I'm getting to share it. So even if just 2 or 3 people watch, that's fine. That's just kind of like icing on the cake that I actually get to share it with somebody else. So what was Detroit like in 2019? And really it was like 2 seasons, wasn't it? You had the first half of the season with Stafford playing, and he was 3-4-1. Maybe you could have been a little bit better than that, but 3-4-1 gave you a chance if you played well down the stretch to make the playoffs. And then all of a sudden, Stafford goes down and you're 0-8, and it's just a wrecking ball of a season. Almost you feel like a wasted season. And it feels like, doesn't it, this year that almost like Patricia and Bob Quinn are kind of fighting to keep their jobs, just fighting to get a playoff spot, fighting to keep their jobs. And I mentioned this in an earlier video. I really think if you're going to hire somebody to do a job, you need to give them the time to do it, especially in the NFL where it's so competitive. And it's competitive even to make the playoffs. It's competitive to get much farther than the playoffs. It's highly competitive. And I do think Patricia and Quinn should not be trying to keep their jobs this year. I don't think that's fair. I would really love to see them keep their jobs for a full 5 seasons and see what they could do. I have a good bit of faith in Patricia, especially watching him work on the defensive side of the football there with the Patriots for several seasons. Don't know Quinn as well, even though he came from the same organization, so I'm not as familiar with what he can do. But I do think these 2 guys together deserve another couple of seasons and don't deserve to just be kicked out after season 3, even if they don't make the playoffs. I don't think that's the barometer. I don't think that's the way to measure it. I do think they need to be given more time and not just looking from one season to the next to have all this pressure on them. But we'll see what happens with that, what ownership decides to do with that. But definitely tell 2 seasons here, 3-4-1, 0-8. The Stafford injury almost makes these numbers here meaningless, right? Because they're all skewed because Stafford wasn't in there all season. You still finished number 10 in passing yards per game, and most of that is because you were playing catch-up for so much of the second half of the season. You were having to pass the football a lot in order just to kind of compete and play catch-up in some of these games. So that's why you finished number 10 in passing yards per game. Even before that, though, while Stafford was in there, you had a fringe top 10 offense, and these numbers do not indicate that, but you were scoring 25.5 points per game. And so even though you finished number 18 in points per game, you were basically on the fringe just inside the top 10 in the NFL in offensive production last year. And that's from a yardage standpoint, points per game standpoint, just about any way you want to measure it. This was a top 10 offense last year. And so the Stafford injury kind of skews all of these numbers here. When you look at the personnel for just a second, the offensive line was good. And even if the starting 5 weren't the best starting 5 in football, I'm not even sure they were top 8 offensive line when you look at the starting 5. The depth is there. It's a very well-built offensive line with depth, with youth, with age. Not an expensive offensive line, so it was good last year. And then tight end was a spot really where I recommended trying to upgrade with a veteran. I didn't want to give up on Hawkinson, didn't want to give up on Isaac Nauta developing, and just bringing a veteran, another veteran on the cheap, somebody who could kind of add to the mix, add to the competitiveness. But even at that, you weren't bad at tight end last year. Running back, I've got you in the red for last year, but I didn't think that was bad either. I just thought you had a group of guys here who just weren't very impressive. And so I recommended at the end of last year bringing in another running back, another veteran guy. And so that's why I've got you in red there. Quarterback and wide receiver, got a good quarterback with Matthew Stafford. And actually Matthew Stafford, we'll see right here, only making $21 million this season. I say only. That's a lot of money. That's a big cap number. But as starting quarterbacks go, especially those top 15 or 20 quarterbacks, it's kind of a discount. And even though I wouldn't put Stafford in the top 10 in terms of performance, he is a good quarterback. You can win with Stafford at quarterback if you got the pieces around him. If you got a pretty good defense supporting the offense on the other side of the football, you can win with Stafford. And so this number here, this $21 million, is not going to keep you from competing for a playoff spot. And if you get everything else in the roster right, it's not going to keep you from competing for a Super Bowl either. So this $21 million here, keep in mind, you've got Dak Prescott, who I don't think is an elite quarterback. He's a good quarterback. He's about to make $35 million a year in Dallas. And, part of the debate there in Dallas is, man, if we don't have an elite quarterback, then why do we want to pay this guy elite money? Because once Dak Prescott signs that contract in Dallas, and I firmly believe that he will, he's going to be the top paid player in the NFL until Patrick Mahomes signs his contract, of course. So it really makes you start to step back and look at Matthew Stafford's contract, which was signed 3 or 4 or 5 seasons ago, I forget. And it's a bit of a discount now for the Lions. Stafford's not hurting. He's not underpaid. But in terms of what you're seeing for the quarterbacks, newer quarterbacks with newer contracts, this is a bit of a discount here, and this is a good thing for Detroit that they kind of have this smaller number now for Matthew Stafford with $21 million. So you've got a quarterback, you've got a good one here, and then of course the wide receiver going through last season, you had a good core group of wide receivers led by Galladay, who's a very good guy, very good player, and then good depth there at wide receiver. So that's what you were last year. What did Detroit do this season on the offensive side of the football when they were already good? Did they make any changes? Did they get better? Did they get worse? And so that's what we're looking at today. We've already looked at quarterback. That hasn't changed. At wide receiver, you've got the same 3 that I already talked about and said they were good. Kenny Galladay, Marvin Jones, Danny Amendola. If Detroit had left the wide receiver spot completely alone and hadn't done a thing to it, they would have been fine. I would have been fine with that. It would have been a good decision on their part. But they drafted a guy right here, Quintus Cephas, who I think is going to help them out. He may not make a big difference in 2020, even though I do think he'll play. I do think he'll contribute. He's kind of the wide receiver who can do a little bit of everything. He blocks well, he's tough, he's fast, he runs good routes. He's not a top end speed kind of a guy, a little bit on the slow side, a little bit in terms of speed, but he's fast enough. And if he can step in, get used to everything in 2020, when you look ahead to 2021, if he's good enough to be one of the top 3 wide receivers on the Lions roster, he could actually save them a good bit of money. Marvin Jones here is going to be gone in free agency after 2020. So that's $9.2 million right there that the Lions can take and put somewhere else on the roster, especially if Cephas here is ready to step in and kind of take over that number 2 role or that number 3 role. Matter of fact, you have the same thing happening here with Danny Amendola, who's making $5 million this offseason. If Cephas can step in and play solid, doesn't have to be great. If he can just step in and be a good number 2 or number 3 receiver, man, it gives the Lions a lot of flexibility here not to worry about losing Jones or Amendola. If Cephas steps in and plays really well and is an absolute number 2 wide receiver, and I don't necessarily expect that to happen, I'm not expecting that, but if we're kind of daydreaming here, if he were to step in and play really well at that number 2 receiver spot, the Lions, in theory, could let Jones go and Amendola go, draft another wide receiver for that number 3 spot next year, and have $14 million to use somewhere else on the roster, whether they put that on the offensive line, or they put it at tight end, or they put it on the defense where they've really struggled. They would have that extra money. So drafting Cephas here, well, I don't think it will make much of a difference in 2020. As a matter of fact, I don't expect it to make any difference in terms of offensive production in 2020. I think it's a really smart thing to do. I think financially it could pay off huge. And even if Cephas turns out not to even be able to get much playing time at all, you still haven't lost anything, all right? This is a gamble very much worth taking. This is a very smart play here by the Lions. We could have lots of debates about if they went right wide receiver, was this the correct wide receiver to take, but that's not for today. Taking a wide receiver here at this spot could financially pay off for the Lions next year. Even if it doesn't, they haven't lost much. They could always bring back Amendola at about the same price. And if they don't want to pay Jones right now $9 million for 2021 and beyond, then they can move back around in the free agency and try to pull somebody else out who's a little bit younger at some comparable numbers to that. So at wide receiver, you're not just fine, but you're in good shape, and you've possibly maybe helped yourself out financially in 21 and 22. Slide over here to this side of the board. These are your running backs. These are your tight ends. At running back, I mentioned last year, they weren't great, weren't impressive. Not even sure they were good. They weren't horrible. They could run the football some, but you really didn't have anybody who could catch the ball in the backfield. You're losing J.D. McKissick out of this group. McKissick's already gone. I think he got too much money with another franchise. Matter of fact, it's one of the franchises that I cover, so when I get over to making that video, I'll probably question that franchise for signing McKissick to that kind of money. But when you look at the running backs right here, Johnson, Swift, Johnson, Scarborough. Swift is the guy, of course, to get excited about. This guy looks like he can run the football with authority. He looks like he can catch the football out of the backfield. He doesn't have to start right away. There's no pressure on him to start right away. The Lions already have a good offense. They already have running backs who aren't horrible. Okay, that's about the best thing you can say about them. You hope, really, that Kerryon Johnson comes back and plays the way he played in 2018. In 2018, he looked like an absolute beast. So you hope he comes back and plays that way, and you kind of hope that Swift is sitting on the bench this year and hoping for some playing time and that he still looks good as well. That would be the ideal. I think Ty Johnson or Bo Scarborough, I doubt you're going to see both players make it all the way through training camp and into the regular season if they have the regular season this year. I really kind of doubt that you're going to see both Johnson and Scarborough here. Either one would be fine. They're both pretty reasonably tough at running the football. Neither one catches the ball out of the backfield too much, but I do think you've upgraded the running back spot right here. The Lions did it through the draft instead of free agency, but I think with Johnson and Swift, if Swift shows up and plays the way it looks like that he can, I think you have a good running back combination. Not a great one, but you have a good one, and I think you have upgraded the running back spot, and in turn, you have upgraded the offense. And so in theory, with a guy who can run the football and catch the ball out of the backfield, if Swift is doing that, and if Johnson were to step back up, and that's a lot of ifing, but if those things were to happen, or if just Swift himself steps up and takes over the starting job and looks good, then you've upgraded the offense, and you take the offense from being something like a 26-point per game offense, maybe up to a 27 or 28-point per game offense, and it just starts to take less pressure off of your defense, put more pressure on the other team. So very good moves here from Detroit, both in the wide receiver category and in the running back category. Tight end, they didn't touch it. They left it completely alone. My thought was maybe bringing a veteran, maybe bringing somebody around $3, $4, $5 million. Don't know if they looked at that at all or not. They bring back the same three guys. You have hope here with Hockenson. We really don't know what Hockenson is. $4.6 million you've got to pay him, which isn't horrible for a tight end. If he's starting and if he's producing, then it's a great deal for a tight end. It's a really good deal. We'll see what Hockenson brings. We just didn't see enough in 2019. I know some people were down on him. We just didn't see enough out of Hockenson in 2019 to be able to say if he could really step up and lock down the starter spot or not. I don't think that we saw anything to make us think he couldn't be in the NFL. We also didn't see anything that made us think this is going to be a superstar. So I think we need another year of Hockenson just to kind of see what he's going to provide you, especially since you drafted him so high a year ago and paying him $4.6 million. The problem here is with Jesse James. This was a guy that you brought in free agency. He's making $5.3 million, and he's probably going to be sitting on the bench making $5.3 million. These two tight ends are not good enough to where you really want to even think about having a two tight end set. I know that's not what most NFL teams do anyway, but even if you wanted to create some mismatches, you just don't have a good enough personnel here. And so what's basically going to happen here, Jesse James is going to be making about $5.3 million this offseason of this season, and he's going to spend most of that on the bench unless he steps up and outplays Hockenson, in which case you've got Hockenson sitting on the bench for $4.6 million. So the tight end spot isn't great. It's not horrible. You just really, really hope that Hockenson steps up and just locks down that starter spot, that he starts to get comfortable blocking he starts to really make himself open more in the passing game and kind of become that fourth option for Matthew Stafford. The Lions have a good offense, but if either Swift or Hawkinson steps up out of tight end or running back, they could really start to be an explosive offense, not just a good offense. They could start pushing up toward an explosive and elite offense if one or both of these guys steps up here. You've still got Nauta here at $675,000. Still maybe a chance that he could contribute as well. Certainly you would hope Nauta, at least after James goes to free agency, you would at least hope that Nauta would be capable of being your backup tight end. The offensive line. This is going to be fun for me. I love covering offensive lines. There's just so much to it, and especially with one of the acquisitions that Detroit made this offseason. I want to start right over here on this end first, actually, with the guard spots. The Lions don't have anybody at guard who's just an absolute lockdown starter that you think, I won't have to improve on that for 3 or 4 seasons. But what they do have is several guys who are capable of either this season or next season of stepping up and locking down that starting spot. And you start right here with Joe Dahl. Now, Joe Dahl is a guy that I consider to be a fringe starter, but I do think he's a starter in the NFL. And while you wouldn't want Joe Dahl to be your best guard on the team or your best offensive lineman, if you've got a good offensive line, you're fine with Joe Dahl being here on the team and being a starter, because I think he can handle that starting spot. And for only $1.9 million, you're getting a great value here if he starts and plays solid. Even if he were sitting on the bench at $1.9 million, he's a great backup. He adds depth, not just because he's a name on the roster, but because he's actually good enough to consider plugging in a starter. So whether he starts or whether he doesn't, the price is right here at $1.9 million. I expect him to hold down that starting spot. I expect him to hold it down all season, barring an injury. That is my expectation. Behind him is Ibushi. Now, I've seen some websites, heard some people talk about Ibushi stepping up and grabbing that other guard spot. I just don't see it. I think the Lions have too much depth at the guard position. I think they have too many people fighting for that other starting guard spot. I don't really think, based on what we've seen in the past from Ibushi, that he is a starter. I think that he's a better backup, and I do think he's good enough. I do think Ibushi is good enough to be adding depth here. A lot of times you hear people talk about drafting somebody in the 5th round and adding depth to a team. And that is only true. That is only true if the player is good enough to be adding depth, good enough to be getting playing time. And I think Ibushi is that. So, for instance, if Dahl were to get injured and Ibushi had to step in and start for 4 games or 8 games, I think you're fine. I don't want Ibushi being my starter for all 16 games as I start this season. I do not expect him to get that starting spot, but we'll see. A lot of competition here at guard. You slide over here, you have Kenny Wiggins. I don't really think that Kenny Wiggins is a starter in the NFL either. I think he's a very fringe starter, and if I had to fringe him in one direction or the other, he'd be out. This is not a guy, based on what we've seen so far, this is not a guy that I want being my starter heading into the season. Again, just like Ibushi, if he steps in for 4 games or 8 games, I'm okay with that, especially because $890,000, the price is right. These are great backups. They do add depth. They're good enough to think about starting, and good enough, just not good enough to say, I hope somebody else steps up and gets that spot. Who else could get that spot? This guy right here, Stenberg. I think he's hailing from Kentucky, University of. Stenberg is a guy, I think in an ideal world, you would love if you're the Lions fans, of the Lions organization. This is the guy that you want to step up and take over that other guard spot. I think Dahl has the one, and I think Stenberg is the guy you want for a couple of reasons. Number one, you drafted him, and in an ideal world, you'd love for him to just step in, take over that role, and be the starter for the next 5 seasons. I don't really think he's going to be the starter when season begins, but it would not be surprising at all if at some point during the season Stenberg isn't developed enough and ready enough to step right in and take over this guard position right here. I think you can expect that. Not promising that, not predicting that, but I think that's something that would not be surprising at all. Stenberg right here has played guard his whole time at Kentucky. I think that he's a very solid guard. He's not a first-round athlete. Don't look for anything like that. But this is a guy who I think has a future in the NFL. I think can step in and play solid and hopefully lock down a starting spot for you guys. I don't know if he's ever going to compete for the All-Pro or the Pro Bowl or anything like that, but I think this is a guy who either this season or next season could be able to step in and take over that starting role. That may not happen at the start of the season. You might see Wiggins, you might see Ibushi, just because this guy isn't ready yet and because Jackson isn't ready yet. But I think Stenberg is the guy to take over here. And in an ideal world, the sooner that happens, the better. Now, why Stenberg versus Jackson? Well, my thinking on Jackson is that you drafted from Ohio State. Excuse me a second. My thinking on Jackson is Jackson played all over the interior of the offensive line. So in an ideal world, Stenberg would start at guard and save you lots of money in the future for the next 4 or 5 seasons, but Jackson would be the guy who, at least for this season, would be the backup center. Stenberg, as far as I know, never played center in college, but Jackson did. Now, Jonah Jackson at Ohio State, he looked a lot better at both the guard spots than he ever did at center, but he does have experience playing there at center, and he's used to moving around. He's used to swapping around in those offensive lines. So for now, 2020, it would be best for your depth if Jackson's good enough to be your backup center just in case Ragnow gets injured, because what you don't want to happen is for Jackson to be starting over here at one of the guard spots, have Ragnow get injured, and then you're starting to play musical chairs. Like, well, okay, who's going to play center? Well, let's put Jackson here at center, and then we've got somebody up here at guard. It just starts to create too many moving parts here. So in an ideal world, which almost never exists, right? I'm sure people in all walks of life, in all corporations, and in all sports franchises kind of laugh at that. But in an ideal world, you'd love for Stenberg to step up, catch that guard spot, give Jackson time to develop, and maybe in the future, Jackson could either be in 2021 your other starting guard, which would be the preference, or if Ragnow moves on in free agency in a couple of seasons, maybe 2 seasons from now, you've got Jackson here waiting in the wings. I'm sure the idea is here for Stenberg to be a starter, Jackson to be a starter. You got your guard spot set for the next 4 or 5 seasons. Statistically, that's not likely to happen. Statistically, you're likely for one of these guys to be a good starter and for one of these guys to be a perpetual backup in the NFL for years to come. Center, we've already mentioned it, Frank Ragnow. We've only seen him for 2 seasons. Season number 1, and he looked okay. Season number 2, absolute standout. I mean, one of the better centers in football. Not the best, not an elite center, but a really, really good center. Played exceptionally well in 2019. You hope he can keep that up in 2020. If he can, it really adds to the strength of that starting 5, because while you have plenty of depth here in Detroit, you do have question marks about the starting 5 right here, and you don't want Ragnow to be one of those question marks. You want him to step up and be as fantastic in 2020 as he was in 2019. He's only making $3.2 million. You've got him for at least the next 2 seasons at a relatively cheap price. Let's move out to tackle, which is a lot more gray area, a lot less depth, and even some questions about one of the starters. Right here was Taylor Decker. There's no question here about Becker. Becker is a nasty blocker. He loves playing football, and it shows. Now, he's not an elite guy. He's not an elite tackle, but this guy can lock down the starting spot. He's very consistent, and while you're not necessarily getting a great deal here money-wise, $10.4 million, by far the highest paid offensive lineman on the team, you're getting good value for what you want here. Do you want to pay that much money to a tackle? Well, not if I can get by with it, not if I can get somebody cheaper who's going to lock down the starting spot. But for now, for this season, Taylor Decker right here, this guy can hold down your starting spot and maybe even has a chance to get Pro Bowl consideration during one of his better seasons. So $10.4 million, as long as he keeps producing at the level he's producing at, this guy holds down your tackle spot, no doubts about it. Behind Decker, there's really not that much depth. You basically got one tackle. Now listen, there's all kinds of tackles on the Detroit Lions. There's all kinds of tackles on every football team in the NFL. Just because they're there don't mean they add depth. In fact, in most cases, they don't add depth. They're just somebody who's there because nobody else is any better. You've got one guy here, Tyrell Crosby. Tyrell Crosby is the guy who's basically backing up both tackle spots. Now that might change if one of the 5th or 6th round draft picks develops, or if one of the undrafted rookies develop, or if somebody you drafted from 2017 steps up. But as of right now, the only proven commodity you have as a backup tackle is this guy right here, Tyrell Crosby. In fact, Crosby to me is a fringe starter. I think you could consider having Crosby start at tackle, and I think if you went into this season with Crosby as your tackle, I think you'd have a chance of being solid there at tackle. So this is a really, really good backup, only $820,000. Depending on what team he was on in the NFL, Crosby might be starting for the whole season, just depending on what team or what offensive line. Now, he won't be starting this year, at least the Lions hope not, because of this guy right here, Vaitai. I will not attempt to say his first name, and I'm not even sure I'm saying his last name right, so I apologize. But Vaitai, $5.4 million. I've got questions about this move, and this is the only move really that I have any questions about from Detroit on the offensive side of the football. Vaitai played for, I think, 4 seasons with the Eagles. In 4 seasons, he started a grand total of 20 games. In 2019, he started a grand total, I think it was 3 games. He didn't start the whole season. I think he played about 500 snaps for the Eagles in 2019. He didn't, when he did start, or when he did play, it wasn't always at the same tackle spot. He moved around a good bit. He moved around his whole career at the tackle spots, usually stepping in for Lane Johnson when Lane Johnson went down for the Eagles. In the 500 and some snaps that we saw out of Vaitai in 2019, he looked really, really good. And you hope, if you're a Lions fan or a Lions executive, you hope that Vaitai plays for you the way he looked during those 500 snaps for the Eagles in 2019. Because when you look back to 2018 and 17 and 16, Vaitai has not looked like a starter at any point, not for any longer than a game or 2. He just has not been able. Now, granted, the Eagles have an excellent offensive line. Very, very difficult to break the starting lineup for the offensive line of the Philadelphia Eagles, with Brandon Brooks there and with at the guard spot, and with I'm blanking anyway, with Lane Johnson there, and I can't even remember who the other tackle is at the moment. But very, very good offensive line for the Eagles. I mean, they have invested in a really good offensive line, one of the best offensive lines in football. So difficult for this guy to break through. And I'm sure that the Lions executives, starting with Bob Quinn and then moving to Matt Patricia and everybody else, I'm sure they probably looked at every one of Vaitai's snaps from his whole time at the Eagles, and probably even watched him some in college where he played tackle as well. My problem is this: 5 years, $45 million. He's only making $5.4 million this year, which, if he's a solid starter, is a fine number. That number immediately jumps to $10.4 million in 2021, and in 22, 23, and 24, I think it hovers right there around the $10 or $11 million mark. That's a lot of money. And you'd better be right if you're the Lions executives, because basically you have banked a 5-year, $45 million contract and a starting spot here on the idea that Vaitai is going to continue playing as well over these next couple of seasons as he did for half of a season in Philadelphia, in which he only started 3 games. And granted, he looked good. He didn't look great. He didn't look Pro Bowl good, but he looked good. He looked capable of holding down a starting spot. It's a lot of money. Now, personally, this is just me. Personally, I would not have signed Vaitai to this contract. I'm not even totally sure that I want Vaitai to be my starter heading into the season, even if he were only making $1 million a season. And to be fair to the Lions, after 2 seasons, if they decide that Vaitai just isn't worth the money, they can get out of this contract for, I think, $4.2 million in dead cap in the 21 offseason. So this isn't a disastrous contract, but you're putting a lot here on one player without having seen a whole lot of him do it in the NFL. My preference would have been If you were going to give money to somebody, I would have preferred to have given it to Graham Glasgow. I know immediately somebody's going to say, we don't pay money to interior offensive linemen, and that's fine. But some NFL franchises do, and some very good NFL franchises pay a lot of money to interior offensive linemen, both to guards and to centers. The reason I like Glasgow so much is not because he's been to a lot of Pro Bowls or an All-Pro. I don't think he's been to any. But he has been a starter every single season of his 4-year career. And the last 3 seasons, he's improved every season. And all of the last 3 seasons, he's looked very, very good. Like a very solid starter. Somebody that you could not improve on unless you paid money to get an All-Pro in. And Graham Glasgow, even though he's playing guard, my preference would have been, if I'm going to put money into the offensive line and give it to somebody, I would rather have given it to Glasgow. And age really is not a factor. I think Glasgow is only a year older than Vaitai. And Glasgow has played better for longer. And his cap is about $2 million a year higher, but that's not much compared to what Vaitai will be making in 2020 and beyond. So if it was me, if I was going to give money to an offensive lineman, even though it's a guard, I would give it right here to Glasgow. Now, personally, I wouldn't have given the money to either one of them. I had no problem with Detroit letting Glasgow go, and then I personally would not have signed Vaitai at all to this kind of money. Maybe to a $3, $4, $5 million a year contract, certainly not the 5-year, $45 million a year contract. Not criticizing Detroit for that. Maybe they've seen something in the videos. I have not watched all the video. I haven't watched hardly any video on Vaitai. So I assume they've done their homework, and I'm assuming they've seen something that I obviously don't know. But just looking at the track record, watching him play, watching how consistent he's been, we don't have much of a track record here from Vaitai. We had a lot from Glasgow, and my preference would have been to have let Glasgow go and then to find somebody with a better track record here at tackle, even if you had to pay them a pretty stout amount of money, or use somebody else in the draft. Get somebody else in the draft right here at tackle. Crosby was a guy here who in theory has just as good a track record as Vaitai. Didn't look as good for 500 snaps in 2019 as Vaitai did, but Crosby's track record is about the same as Vaitai's. When you take the 2 or 3 seasons put together, it's about the same. So we'll see how this works out. It's not going to have a major effect on the Lions in 2020 anyway. They were going to come back with a solid offensive line with plenty of depth. Not as much depth at tackle as they got at guard. But right here is the one question mark that I do have. Maybe Vaitai plays very well. Maybe he locks down the starting spot. Personally, if I'm going to throw this kind of money at someone, I would rather have a bigger track record to view than what they had Vaitai. That's just the amount of risk that I would be willing to place on a player that we haven't seen perform that well for that long in the NFL. I think we've covered everything. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Have a great one. Goodbye.